the cities. The protests are entirely non-violent. Farmer movements are very clear that they don't want to disrupt or harm local residents of Delhi. In fact, they have kept their resolve. They have appointed security teams. They are monitoring the protests. Of course, there have been several cases of violent elements who have tried to derail the protests. Of course, this is a strategy, especially by the right, to destabilize the protest. But the main form of violence has come from the governments, which has used tear gas, water cannons. They have created barricades. They've prevented the media from reaching the farmers. There's also been a mediatic violence where the government has labeled farmers as terrorists, as separatists, and all kinds of ridiculous attempts. Thankfully, they have not stuck. And the farmers have been holding the moral high ground and have been winning the respect of Indian society. Now coming to the part about what makes these protests unique, and especially how women farmers have participated in these protests. So just like in other parts of the world, in rural India, there's a class conflict between the landed peasantry and the landless workers. The landed peasantry, no matter how small or marginal their land holdings, tend to come from the dominant castes. Now, these castes are not high caste, they are oppressed castes, but they are economically and politically considered to be dominant because they own land. While the landless farmers tend to come from Dalit castes, and landless farmers or landless workers tend to work on the fields of the dominant caste peasants, and so there's obviously a caste conflict there. But what we're seeing in these protests is a real effort to form a joint rural front against capital. We're seeing support from landless labor, rural organizations, of Dalit farmer organizations who have stood behind the farmers' protest. They have joined the farmers' protest. Their issues are forming part of these larger protests. And at the same time, women farmers, irrespective of their caste background, even if they might come from so-called somewhat landed families, small farmer families, they tend to be entirely landless, and only 10% of the women in India have any form of land ownership. So women are landless, and they are not considered to be farmers even by official standards. Even if they are working on their own farm, they are considered to be the helpers, right? So in the context of growing feminization of agriculture, where many agrarian farmers and rural people have shifted to urban centers, to urban industrial sectors, looking for better job opportunities, we are in a situation where rural India has been left at the responsibility of women farmers who are now tending to the farms, yet they're not owners, right? They're not considered to be owner cultivators, they're considered to be laborers or helpers, right? So women have very specific issues, and women have played a very, very important role in these farmers' protests, not just as cooks or cleaners, right? They're not just playing supportive role, but they're actually at the forefront. They're having their own protests. Women are driving tractors and arriving at the protest, which is something you don't traditionally see in the Indian landscape. Women have held their own spaces. Recently they've had their own women farmers parliament, which is in the context of a larger farmers parliament going on in parallel to the government parliament. And women farmers have brought their issues of landlessness, issue of them not being recognized as farmers, of unfair wages, lack of access to entitlements that they deserve because they are doing most of the farming in this country. In closing, I will say that these protests have played a very important role in reviving the farmers' movement in India, right? Many erstwhile factions of farmers' organizations who didn't see eye to eye are now coming together. They are united. They're learning how to work with each other. They are really broadening the mandate of farmers' organizations by including landless farmers, by including women farmers, and giving and creating spaces for them. And even more importantly, in the context of authoritarian populism, where our government has created so many enemies, right, within our own peoples, it is the farmers who are arguably leading the struggle in the defense of a plural and diverse India. And so their struggle represents much more than the fight against neoliberalism. I will borrow from the words of Mr. Yogendra Yadav, who's a public intellectual and a member of the farmers movement himself, that farmers are fighting to defend the very idea of India itself. Thank you.
Hi, can everyone hear me? I think it's fine. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. Last talk, I'll try to make it brief. So my name is Nassim Nobari, and I co-founded an organization called Seed the Commons. It's a small grassroots organization that we founded first in Switzerland and then moved over to San Francisco in California. Seed the Commons is an organization that's at the intersection of a number of movements: food justice, food sovereignty, animal rights, environmental justice, etc. And a lot of what we have focused on, being small and being interested in creating awareness around the importance of food systems and so on, has been political education, so that instead of having to focus on just one or two things, we could really increase awareness and empower activists to get involved in a number of issues. So during the years that I was director of Seed the Commons, perhaps the main thing that I did was that I really helped build the veganic farming movement in a number of ways. So veganic farming, vegan organic, so it's basically organic farming without animal inputs, exploitation. And we did that in a number of ways, connecting farmers together, coming and speaking about it, soil, not oil, many things. But in addition to that, I had also been involved in other social movements, largely around land, food, both internationally and in the US. And so a few years ago, or a couple years ago, I was invited to write a chapter for a book called Rethinking Food and Agriculture. I don't know if it's very visible. Rethinking Food and Agriculture, New Ways Forward. And I was invited to write a book on a chapter on social movements and their role in changing our food and agriculture system. So that's really been the impetus of this panel in the first place. So one of the things that I touch upon in the chapter is first of all, the title of the panel is The Role of Social Movements in Affecting Radical Change. And I know that that's kind of a fashionable word now, so I want to explicitly talk about why I use the word radical. Radical means from the root. And so when we're talking about radical change, we're not just, saying like a cool change or a lot of change. It's really about fundamentally changing the system rather than making improvements to it. And so radical for me is a different approach than liberal, for example, which is about making changes to the existing system. So we don't want a food system dominated by Nestle with slightly better practices. What we want is a food system without Nestle at all. And so that's why I talk about radical change. So one of the things in the book that I make a case for is that to achieve radical change, we only can look to grassroots social movements, and solutions cannot come from the top down, as Carlos said, because there's a contradiction in terms. Basically, the whole point of what we would call the top, large multinationals and so on, the capitalist class, the whole point is to generate profit, and that mechanism of generating profit is precisely what's causing the problems that we're trying to solve. And therefore, you cannot look to a company like Bayer, for example, to be solving the problem of hunger or climate change. So the top, in terms of putting forth top-down solutions, what they're really putting forth is what Via Campesina, the phrase they coined, is false solutions. So something that appears like a solution, but in fact reinforces the status quo. So in the case of GMOs have been marketed for a long time as something that is going to feed the world. Supposedly there is a problem of scarcity, and GMOs come in as the thing that's going to produce more. But in fact, what GMOs really are designated to do is to consolidate wealth. And it is the process of wealth consolidation that has been the cause of hunger in the first place. So, the way that false solutions are put forth and the way that large corporations sort of impose themselves on our food systems are done through a number of ways. But I'm quite interested in the psychological and cultural aspect of this mechanism. And so they convince us through certain narratives. And one of the things is a narrative of lack. So with GMOs, I think it's fairly obvious. They've been marketed for a long time as the thing that is going to feed the planet, with the premise being that we don't have enough food and that's why hunger exists. But it's been documented many times that in fact we do have enough food and we do have the mechanisms without genetic engineering to, produce abundant, healthy food and so on. Now, I think that for the Soil Not Oil audience, of course, these things are pretty evident. But what I'm talking about isn't really just about large multinationals, but other actors, philanthropists, for example, who also follow the same kind of model. For example, a narrative of lack would be we're going to give food aid, give charity to address the problem of hunger. And this is appealing to funders because it doesn't actually address the structural issues that are causing the problems in the first place. So I think that grassroots social movements are capable of putting forth real solutions that address the problems because they're based on a more correct political analysis of what the problem is in the first place. You cannot address a problem if you don't know what that problem is. And so if we're going out and saying we're going to solve the problem of food scarcity, we're going to be putting forth false solutions because food scarcity is not the issue. However, if we say we're going to solve the problem of oppression and usurpation and land grabbing and all of these things that are driving poverty and displacement that then can lead to, inadequate access to food and so on, then we can solve the problem because we've correctly identified the issue. So I was asked to write this chapter around social movements at a very interesting time. So it was summer of 2018, and I was in San Francisco. We in September, we had a climate march, Rise for Climate, what was it called? Rise for Climate, Jobs, and Justice. Effectively, it was the largest climate march that has ever happened on the West Coast. And so I was helping organize that march. And I was, with the whole march, and I was also specifically organizing a contingent that was being led by veganic farmers who came from around North America. And I got this email, when you read this chapter, and I was very happy, but I had these ideas about, the importance of grassroots social movements and how we need to, bring the people in the street and so on. And we can't have, Nestle, for example, dictating the solutions. But at the same time, as I was organizing that protest, I was also getting a real lesson in some of the impediments to grassroots organizing, not only from the usual suspects, but also from within what would seem, the movements themselves. And so, really it allowed me to think and learn more about this dynamic between professionalized nonprofits, professionalized activists, that kind of reality that has grown over the past few decades with grassroots activists. And so one of the things that was happening at that time was that, some of us had been active for months organizing this protest and, really people who were local and so on. And then, within the last 2 weeks before the march, you would see large, well-funded nonprofits who had had no involvement in the organization who suddenly would jump in, and in jumping in would tell their funders and their base and their audience, look what we're doing, and we're at this march and we're the ones who are leading this thing, and use that as a way to get funding. And so I think that has to do both with having established relationships with funders, but also with, brand recognition, a certain audience, and so on. And these are the sorts of processes that result in often a de-radicalization and a depoliticization of social movements. You have a dynamic in which you have, let's say, larger nonprofits who are operating, whether they want to or not. I mean, it really might not have started out as something badly intentioned, but are operating on a logic of getting funding, and that becomes the real driver. And so the grassroots often is there as something that builds up momentum, builds up interest in a certain issue, for example, agroecology, but then that can get co-opted not only by companies like Whole Foods, but also co-opted by others that appear to be within the same movement, but have perhaps a less, not perhaps, that often have a less radical message because funders don't really want to fund a radical message. And so, for example, agroecology, that's been noted by many people that it has been co-opted a lot, and it is something that is inherently political, but is often used in a way that has been depoliticized. So, and I think that in the United States, this is not something I can go into so long now, but I think that this is especially strong with the way funding works here, the potential to get a lot of funding, and then, you know, other aspects of American culture, people getting out of college with a lot of debt and needing to find, you know, a career. And anyway, so there are a lot of aspects that make social movements not this monolith, but rather a terrain in which it's not only Bayer and Monsanto who are going to be hijacking the message, but also others who are really more part of the thing. If people here have not read the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, I do recommend that book to you. It kind of lays out some of this, although it was written maybe 20 years ago. So what I want to speak a little bit about is how some of these dynamics that I've touched upon play out locally to where I am in the Bay Area and in California in general. So, you know, there's obviously a lot of awareness built around climate change. Now, you know, today I went out, and in San Francisco, it's the first day of smoke, so we don't have good air quality today because of the wildfires. There has been increased awareness around the importance of fighting the corporate food system, increased awareness around the central importance of moving away from industrial agriculture and how this is basic to so many other struggles. And in San Francisco, there's a lot of awareness around that. And the answer that has become very popular over the past few years has been the idea of regenerative grazing. Now, I argue that in the Bay Area, this has become something that was born not out of mass social movements, but rather is actually something that became popular through yoking this message to that of agroecology, which was built over decades globally by mass movements. And there has been a sort of, I wouldn't say hijacking, but a yoking to that message where agroecology has, and others as well, but the movements have really spent a long time communicating to the public the importance of fighting against industrial agriculture and why. And then as awareness finally built around that, we have people saying, well, yes, we need to do that. And we are the ones doing that. And that's grazing and regenerative grazing. Now, in California, grazing is something that started with colonization, and not only started with colonization, but it has been a central part of colonization economically, culturally, both for settler communities, but also for the colonization and acculturation of Native Americans, and has had and continues to have a huge impact on the ecology as non-native animals were brought here, reproduced here, you know, became in conflict with native animals and so on. And as an industry that, or an institution that was central to the colonial process in California, you know, ranchers were given free lands that were native lands and so on. And so while now we have companies like Bayer who are the new face of colonization and doing what colonizers have basically always done, the old colonial institutions are still very much alive. And in California, that includes cattle ranching. So what we have here is a situation, and I'm going to speak a little bit about Point Reyes specifically, where because of the general awareness that has grown around the importance of moving away from industrial agriculture, we have a an institution, an industry that came from preferential land access, preferential access to tax dollars and so on, that has taken advantage of this to say, well, we are the ones who are doing this. So it's not a movement that's built through mass social mobilization, but is riding on the coattails of one who did. And here we find the same kind of structural reasons that exist, you know, in other kind of larger nonprofits. Well, I'm not talking about one nonprofit here, but larger nonprofits have access to better funding and so on. And here it's the same thing. So, you know, who has the money to fund conferences, who has the money to make Kiss the Ground, et cetera, et cetera. And then cultural biases, just like the narrative of lack in California, we have a narrative of lack where, for example, we need, you know, animals in our ecosystems. And the way that that plays out in Point Reyes is that the narrative of lack in Point Reyes is that if we don't have cows in our ecosystems, it will be devoid of animal life. But in reality, we have our native animals, the Tule elk, who are there, who are erased by that discourse in the same way that, you know, grassroots solutions are always erased, and who are, just like they were 200 years ago, continue to be killed, deprived of water, et cetera, in this conflict with invasive species, basically. So that's what's going on in California. And I think that it's important for the environmental movement to understand that there needs to be a certain discernment when we look at answers to the corporate food system and corporate farming. Here we have an example of something that is widely starting to be supported, but if we look at the situation in Point Reyes, which Skylar Thomas will speak about more tomorrow, what we're looking at is not radical change, it's really more of the same. And we have, you know, one industry kind of taking advantage of a much broader set of voices. All right, so I'll leave it there for questions, and I'll let Miguel kind of moderate that.
Thank you so much, Carlos and Nassim. I don't know if we have enough time for questions. I think, and also the other event that we have ended. So we have only the Zoom, and in the Zoom, I don't think that we have questions, but I have a couple of questions, and one of them is for Carlos Marentes, that I have been working myself for many years in immigrant rights. A lot of people know me more for my work on immigrant rights, globalization, democracy. And I wonder, Carlos, you are a veteran in all these struggles, how do you see the after COVID situation in health and labor for immigrants that are undocumented?
That's a good question, especially in these pandemic times where immigrants have been deeply affected. There's a lot of suffering, deaths, especially in the immigrants communities, and the inequality and the exclusion of the system is very clear now. You know, I mean, it's not that the immigrants were better before the pandemic, but I guess the pandemic, the COVID-19, show us to all and show to the world, you know, the conditions of exclusion, of inequality that have existed for so long. I see one very important concept that we have been using for many years, and that we've been trying to convince social movements and sister organizations and organizations that we converge in the struggle for immigrant rights and for human rights, is that to us, and then this is something also related, Nassim, to the issue of agriculture, the fight to take away our food from the hands of the corporations and to try to contain the destruction of peasants' economies abroad. as a result of the corporations, corporate capital, but also the United States policies that favor agribusiness. I guess we have arrived to a point that we need to see migration in a different way. The regular person, see migration through the perspective of compassion, through the perspective of these people have to migrate, have to leave their families, their communities, because they are unable to survive due to economic hardships, either created by, by actions, public policies, or by disasters during this climate crisis. Something that I wanted to mention is that when the caravans started to come to cross Mexico from Central America in an attempt to enter United States, and the Trump administration decided to wage a war to contain those caravans. Something that was clear is that, that most of the people in the United States don't understand why people have to migrate, have to face the militarization of the border, and then the organized crime through their journey, through Mexico. But, and then, somebody was asking me why all these people from Honduras are coming to United States. And people don't remember that in 2009, there was a military coup in Honduras that basically exacerbated the situation of the violence, especially in rural communities. And behind that violence, we find all, and we find all this agribusiness, this corporate agribusiness. At that time, the Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden was the vice president. And that military coup in 2009 was organized and planned in the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa. So I think that we have come to a point that we need to see two things. First, who is responsible for the migration, the crisis of migration that we see today? And then the second part, and that's the most important for us, is that we need to see migration as an act of resistance of people against the attempts to make them disappear. All those families, all those migrants, attempting to cross the militarized border are basically defying, challenging the system, and telling the system that they are attempting to survive. And so we need to see migration as an act of resistance for one very important reason: to give migrants a role of protagonist of change. And here, I want to mention something very important. The percentage of women in the movement of migration, the displacement from rural communities, from peasant communities, is very important. So we also need to highlight the role of protagonists of change of women. And we have to do that not only in regards to migrant rights, but also in the issue of environmental and climate justice. And that's a very difficult point for too many social movements, because there's resistance to deal with this patriarchal aspect of capitalism. So I think that in all these movements, struggles, efforts, attempts to find a way out of this devastation of nature and this oppression of people, of so many people, it's very important that we see migrants and women as protagonists of change, not only as the victims, you know. So it's very important that we leave, for example, bottles of water in the desert of Arizona, but it's more important if we give migrants, women, and migrant families the role that they have to change, the reality that is, turning our world upside down.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I have a question also for Nassim, I'm sorry. And you know, Carlos, 80% of the food that is produced in the world is produced by women. 80% is what I have here from reliable information from agroecologists. And they are really feeding the world, no corporations, right? And we have to think about in the United States, what is the main source of labor are immigrants. Many of them are undocumented. Every time that we talk about food justice, we have to talk about immigrants. And most of them are Latinos that don't have documents, and they came from Mexico, from Central America, and they are working in the fields in the worst conditions. So I think that is very important every time that we open this discussion about if it's cool permaculture, if it's ethical to do regenerative agriculture, we have also to think who is really feeding us and our immigrants. So thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you for your work, for joining us. And Nassim, I have a question for you, and it has more to do with, well, in Soil Not Oil, we always practice like the freedom of speech. We invite all kind of people to talk openly about any topic, and we invite people from different backgrounds, from different economic levels, from different social classes. So, and not to clash, but to open the discussion about different kind of things. And I really wonder, you as a woman, as an organizer, because you are organizing this conference on veganism and veganic farming. And I wonder, what is your main challenge, your main obstacle when you are trying to organize?
Hi, sorry. So in general, you mean, right? And my experiences in general. Well, just to go back. So the conference that I used to organize, it wasn't on veganism or veganics. It was a conference on radical food politics, where we would look at all of the kind of a holistic view of the problems with our food system and the solutions. And it was not focused exclusively on agriculture, but we did put importance in agriculture being really the basis of the rest. And so in that part of the conference, the farmers that I would invite were farmers who were ecological farmers, in some cases who identified as agroecological farmers, who had been doing this for a long time, but who also were vegan. So it wasn't that we were pushing veganism in the way that people normally do. It was more that was the framework and the way that people don't farm cats or dogs. So it was a different approach, and it was broader. But anyways, to get to your answer, the thing is that we have never been a big, well-known organization that would attract, undercover agents from Nestle, that sort of thing. I've seen that sort of thing happen. Like when I was involved with the anti-globalization stuff, you had companies like Nestle who would do those things. And so, we never had those sorts of challenges. The challenges.
I just want to say that I have had myself personal debates with the vice president of Monsanto with his bodyguards. They came to approach me and to total with me, the vice president, the former vice president of Monsanto. So, and I have in my conferences people from these companies. I have received many of emails. Our website several times shut down, along with other websites that fighting GMOs. So I know what you're talking about. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, back in like 2001, I had actually just been in Chiapas, and I went to there was a biotechnology conference, and I was part of the protests that was happening against that. And it was an important moment of political education for me, because there was a talk that was given by some organic farmers, and they were explaining, the problems with industrial agriculture and so on. And there was a guy in the crowd that started attacking them and really just creating a big mess. And my first instinct was like, oh, they shouldn't have kicked him out. They should have engaged with him in debate. And then later I learned that he was really planted there, and he worked with the industry. And, you learn about those things. But, this is 20 years ago, and I didn't understand at the beginning what was happening. Anyways, so we haven't, as far as I know, we haven't been big enough to attract that sort of issue. So what's been really surprising to me that the obstacles for me have been more within the movements themselves. And I really started to understand that in the case, as I said, we've interacted with a lot of different organizations from different movements. It hasn't been just one, but one of the kind of groups that we've interacted with has been the animal rights movement. And I really started to see over the past 10 years in the United States how I think there is a very big difference between kind of the actual activists who are really going out on the weekend and genuinely, doing this and that to make change, and the professional class that is trying to get funding, to get jobs, to get a career. Maybe they're 25 and have student debt, and they're like, I'm going to be the next thought leader. And I think in the United States, I will just put this in here, is that I think that woke culture in the United States is a sort of appropriation and displacement of actual radical thought and politics. So, so it's been more within the movements that I find a lot of issues, which I started to think, this is not what I've heard from people like my parents and others who were active in the 70s, 60s, so on. There's always been infighting, there's always been competition, but it's different when you have what is effectively a nonprofit industrial complex where people are primarily looking for funding. And so I've found obstacles in that sense, where you have basically a dynamic where grassroots organizers like myself put in the work to build awareness and so on, and then others can kind of like wait for that to be done and then come in to co-opt, appropriate, plagiarize, etc. And in some cases, like I see, for example, who opens my newsletters, and I see like the white man who's been on all the news things and start talking about certain things, and he clicks on all the links. And so you have a dynamic where people who have access to funding, visibility, have big audience will not lift up the grassroots and say, hey, those guys are doing something interesting, you should look at that. But instead they will say, that's really interesting, I need to take it for myself, and then go talk to my funders. And often the radical part of the message gets lost when that happens. And so for me, those have been the obstacles. And I would mention, to kind of like go back to the woke culture thing, that I think that in the US, identity politics play out in a way that's very perverse. So one of the founders of Seed the Commons actually is of indigenous Mexican descent. And, something that since he was a teenager and now he's in his 40s, he's been very, very interested in, talking about the milpa and talking about Mesoamerican food systems. And, this has been a really big topic for him. And, one of the things that turned out people were very interested in was to kind of grab that, but in a superficial way, not really interested in engaging in the actual ideas around that, but saying, aha, we're white-led nonprofits. If we talk about the milpa, if we talk about something indigenous Mexican, that's going to look cool. So ID politics has played out in a perverse way where rather than let's make visible what this person is doing and saying and his ideas. Let's take those because it actually increases our thing. So I think that for me, that's really been the obstacle of a certain erasure of, you know, the people who have always been the least visible, because of the creation of certain industries around change, really the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. You know, it reminds me many things that happened to me that have happened through the years. And well, first now I am living in Chiapas and I am working with Mayan Sotzil farmers every day. So I would invite people who really want to know traditional farming. You can see my skin is very dark because I spend a lot of time in the mountain in the sun, farming and doing things. I would invite them to really leave their comfort zone and come here to visit me. You know, they can contact me. But another thing is that you remind me this book that I found in internet is Making Immigrant Rights Real. And in this one, it has 5 chapters related to San Francisco. And one of them is a campaign that I launched in 2007. And then is about the municipal identification card of San Francisco. And it's about the strategies and everything that happened. But here, what this writer, a student, a postdoctoral student did, she came to interview the nonprofit industrial complex, the agencies provider of services for immigrants, and she came to interview me also, and to interview the people working for Tom Amiano, who was supporting this initiative. And she ended up talking about why the nonprofit industrial complex didn't like me and why they didn't let me speak in public events. When I have launched the project, everyone recognized that was my idea. I organized my 3 first conference on municipal ID cards. We put implementation in Oakland, in Richmond. When they implemented in New York, they called me from the TV from New York to talk about my experiences, not to the other people, but they always they took the idea and they tried to overshadow me in different ways. Even everyone knew that was my project. And in this book, this is totally neutral, and she's talking why they didn't like me. Because I was man, I didn't speak good English, and I was not paid to do that, and they were paid to do that, you know, supposedly. So that was a big thing that happened in 2007, 8, 9. I have to face it myself, and I am glad we succeed. And many people still tell me about this kind of campaigns. We stopped the car impoundment against unlicensed drivers in Northern California, in Santa Rosa, San Rafael, San Francisco. We created the first response alert network for immigrant raids by ICE in 2007. And we never got any money from the agencies provider of services, even we approached all of them to get some support. So, and what they did is just to block us. So I totally understand what you are talking about. And thank you so much. You know, we have to go, but thank you so much. Tomorrow there will be more discussions that are very interesting. Today we have different kind of brains, different kind of experiences. Tomorrow is going to be amazing. I hope you, Carlos, and Nassim can join us, or we can continue the discussion another time. You have my email. You can share it with Carlos, and I support fully support everything you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.